There's a planet so close to Earth that on certain nights you can see it with the naked eye. No telescope needed, no dark sky required. It hangs in the evening like a lantern someone left burning brilliant, beautiful, seemingly peaceful. For thousands of years, poets called it the morning star. Ancient civilizations worshipped it, and for most of human history we stared at it and imagined something romantic, something familiar, something close to home. We were catastrophically wrong. What hides beneath those gleaming clouds is not a twin of Earth. It is not a neighbor you would ever want to visit. It is an environment so hostile, so chemically violent, so fundamentally alien, that the machines we have sent there did not survive long enough to even tell us the full story. They melted. They were crushed. They were dissolved. And in the brief moments before they died, they recorded things that scientists have spent decades trying to explain, and still cannot. Here is what nobody is saying loudly enough. We do not fully understand Venus. We sent probes. We lost probes. We recovered fragments of data from probes that died in conditions no laboratory on Earth can fully replicate. And buried inside that data, inside those final transmissions from machines screaming their last readings back across 40 million kilometers of space, are anomalies that have never been resolved, chemical signatures that should not exist, atmospheric readings that defy the models, and something moving inside those clouds that has been photographed from above, tracked across the entire surface of the planet, and still has no agreed-upon explanation after nearly a century of observation. This is the story of what the Soviets found on Venus, what they were not able to explain, what modern science is only now beginning to understand, and why, right now in 2025, the entire planetary science community is preparing to go back and find out what they missed. The story begins not with glory, but with a string of failures so spectacular that they would be almost comedic if the stakes were not so enormous. In 1961, the Soviet Union launched the first spacecraft ever aimed at another planet. It was called Venera 1, and it went silent before it even reached its target. Nobody heard from it again. The Soviets tried again, and again. Early probes failed to leave Earth's orbit. One of them, Cosmos 96, crashed back onto Earth near the town of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania in 1965, immediately igniting UFO rumors that persisted for decades. The Soviets were not sending alien spacecraft. They were just failing, repeatedly, to reach a planet that seemed to actively resist human investigation. But think about what that means. The most technologically advanced space program on Earth, armed with the full resources of a superpower, sent machine after machine toward this planet and watched them fail. Not because of poor engineering, not because of bad luck, because Venus does not allow visitors easily. Venera 4, launched in 1967, spent more than 90 minutes taking measurements as it slowly floated down through the dense atmosphere of Venus. It detected very elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the air, as well as a complete absence of a global magnetic field. That last part, the missing magnetic field, was important in ways scientists did not fully appreciate at the time. Earth's magnetic field protects life from solar radiation and helps retain the atmosphere over geological timescales. Venus had none. And the more the Soviets looked, the more they realized they were not looking at Earth's twin. They were looking at Earth's nightmare. The last data Venera 4 sent back revealed an atmosphere that was 22 times thicker and 250 degrees hotter than anywhere on Earth. It was made almost entirely of carbon dioxide, with toxic clouds of sulfuric acid, turning the sky yellow. But the data cut out way before the probe reached the surface, so scientists had no idea how much worse it got. Read that again? The probe was still falling. It was still transmitting, and then silence, because the planet killed it before it landed. At that point, no spacecraft had ever survived to the surface of another world, and now the Soviets understood exactly why. They did not stop. They redesigned everything. In 1970, Venera 7 became the first spacecraft to soft land on another planet and transmit data back to Earth. Despite a rough landing that left the probe on its side, Venera 7 managed to send back valuable information about Venus's surface conditions for 23 minutes before succumbing to the extreme heat and pressure. 23 minutes. That was the entire window of survival for the most advanced landing machine humanity had ever built. 23 minutes in a place where the surface temperature sits at around 465 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to melt lead, hot enough to make the inside of a pizza oven feel like a cool breeze. And the atmospheric pressure at the surface is equivalent to being nearly a kilometer underwater in Earth's oceans. But here is where it gets worse. Because those numbers, the temperature, the pressure, the acid clouds, those were just the beginning of what the Soviets were discovering. The real mystery was not the heat. The real mystery was what was happening in the clouds themselves. Venera 9 captured the first ever images from the surface of another planet, revealing a desolate, rocky landscape bathed in an eerie orange light. The orange. That detail sounds trivial, but it is not. The thick cloud layers above Venus filter sunlight in a way that bathes the entire surface in a dim, reddish-orange glow, like the light inside a furnace. Imagine standing on a world where the sky is permanently the color of embers, where the clouds above you are made of concentrated sulfuric acid, where the wind at the surface is gentle, almost peaceful, while the clouds 60 kilometers above you are racing around the entire planet at nearly 370 kilometers per hour. That atmospheric superrotation, the fact that Venus's atmospheric cloud level rotates around the entire planet in just 4 Earth days, while the planet itself takes 243 days to rotate, is one of the most bizarre phenomena in the entire solar system. Think about what that means. The planet spins slowly, almost lazily, but the atmosphere above it is screaming around the globe at hurricane speed, and nobody has ever fully explained why. The energy budget does not quite add up. The models do not perfectly match the observations. There is something about Venus's atmosphere that is fundamentally still not understood. And then came 1978, and a mission that changed everything. Venera 11 and 12 in 1978 extended surface operations to over 100 minutes, detecting possible lightning. Lightning on Venus. The Soviets had equipped these probes with an instrument called Groza, the Russian word for thunder, specifically designed to detect electrical activity in the atmosphere. And what Groza picked up from inside the Venusian clouds was extraordinary, massive, continuous electrical discharges, not occasional storms, not scattered lightning strikes, something more like a constant roiling electromagnetic fury embedded inside the cloud layers themselves. Now think about what that implies. Here's a planet completely shrouded in thick, opaque clouds. No telescope has ever seen its surface directly. The Soviets were sending probes down through those clouds and hearing them crackle with electricity. And scientists were asking a question that nobody had a good answer for. What is driving this? Lightning on Earth is generated by the complex dynamics of water-based storm systems. But Venus has no water to speak of. The chemistry that generates lightning in Earth's atmosphere should not work the same way in a sulfuric acid environment. And yet, there it was recorded by Soviet instruments, confirmed by later missions, and still not fully explained by any model today. But this is where the story takes a turn that most people have never heard about. It was simply loss. But here's where it gets worse. Because while the residents were being told they were the chosen guardians of Soviet civilization, what was actually happening to the land and water around them was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. And the authorities knew. They always knew. Between the start of Mayak's operations and the 1957 disaster, workers dumped the complex's radioactive waste into the nearby Teka River for years, not by accident, not through ignorance. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Soviet nuclear program that dumping radioactive waste directly into the river system was an acceptable solution to the problem of waste disposal. Hundreds of thousands of people downstream had no idea that the water they were drinking, the fish they were eating, the soil they were farming, had been systematically contaminated by one of the most radioactively toxic substances on Earth. And then, on September 29, 1957, the situation escalated beyond even the most pessimistic internal projections. On 29th of September 1957 at 4:22 p.m., an explosion occurred within stainless steel containers, located in a concrete canyon 8 meters deep, used to store high-level waste. The explosion completely destroyed one of the containers, out of 14 total containers in the canyon. The explosion was caused because the cooling system in one of the tanks at Mayak, containing about 70 to 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste, failed and was not repaired. The temperature in it started to rise, resulting in evaporation and a chemical explosion. Read that again. The cooling system failed and was not repaired. This was not a sudden, unpredictable mechanical failure. This was a known problem that was allowed to fester because, in the logic of the Soviet system, the production schedule mattered more than the safety protocols. The weapon had to be built, the plutonium had to be processed, and if a cooling system needed repair, the repair could wait. Until it couldn't. The explosion was estimated to have had a force of at least 70 tons of TNT. The explosion lifted a concrete slab weighing 160 tons, 70 tons of TNT, a 160-ton concrete lid blown off like it was made of paper. And what was released into the air above the Ural Mountains was not just shrapnel and heat and pressure. It was 20 million curies of radiation spreading across 2,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory in a plume that came to be known as the East Urals radioactive trace. Approximately 270,000 people were exposed to high levels of radiation, and the fallout contaminated around 2,000 square kilometers of territory, leading to significant ecological damage, including the deaths of local plant life. In the aftermath, the Soviet government evacuated about 10,000 residents and took measures to conceal the incident, including demolishing towns to prevent return. They demolished towns to prevent people from returning. This is the detail that most people miss when they look at the Kishtim disaster, The name the Western World eventually gave to the 1957 explosion, named after the nearest town that actually appeared on maps, because the real location was still officially non-existent. The Soviet response was not to evacuate, decontaminate, and publicly acknowledge. The Soviet response was to erase, to add more erasure on top of erasure, to demolish the physical evidence of contamination, and then simply never speak of it. The Kyshtym disaster is the second worst nuclear incident by radioactivity released after the Chernobyl disaster. It is the only disaster classified as level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, which ranks by population impact. Level 6, on a scale that goes to 7. And yet, the Western world did not know it happened for decades, because the city at its center was not on any map, because the state that caused it had built an entire architecture of concealment so comprehensive that even a nuclear explosion could be hidden inside it. And this is where everything changes, because Chernobyl, when it happened in 1986, at least had the virtue of being visible. The radioactive cloud drifted across borders. Western sensors detected it. The world eventually forced an acknowledgement. But the Kyshtym disaster had no such external visibility. It happened inside a secret geography, within a city that did not exist, operated by a state that had already demonstrated it could maintain silence about events of almost any scale. The disaster was kept almost entirely hidden from the Soviet public for 3 decades, and from the global public even longer. But let's go deeper, because while the Kyshtym disaster is the most dramatic single event in this story, it is not the most disturbing ongoing reality. Through a series of accidents and spills, the Russian nuclear facility at Mayak contaminated more than 15,000 square kilometers with highly radioactive waste. Between 1949 and 1956, 100 petabecquerel of radioactive waste was dumped in the Techa River system, including strontium-90, cesium-137, plutonium, and uranium. 15,000 square kilometers. That is not a spill. That is not an accident. That is a sustained, deliberate policy of treating the surrounding environment as an acceptable sacrifice for the goals of the Soviet nuclear program. And the people who lived in the villages along the Techa River, people who were never inside the secret city, never worked in the nuclear facilities, never signed any agreement or accepted any special privilege, they were contaminated anyway. They drank contaminated water, they ate contaminated fish, they farmed contaminated soil, and they were never told. Not officially, not clearly, not in a way that gave them any meaningful ability to protect themselves or their children. The city's residents know the truth, however, that their water is contaminated, their mushrooms and berries are poisoned, and their children may be sick. Ozersk and the surrounding region is one of the most contaminated places on the planet, referred to by some as the graveyard of the Earth. The graveyard of the Earth. Sit with that phrase for a moment. This is not hyperbole from an anti-nuclear activist. This is the assessment of scientists and researchers who have studied the long-term environmental impact of Mayak's operations. The region around Ozersk is among the most radioactively contaminated pieces of land on the surface of the planet. And 100,000 people live there, right now, today. And here is the detail that makes this story transcend the Cold War and become urgently relevant to the present moment. Yet the majority of residents do not want to leave. They believe they are Russia's chosen ones and even take pride in being citizens of a closed city. This is where they were born, got married, and raised their families. It is where they buried their parents and some of their sons and daughters too. This is not Stockholm Syndrome, or at least it is not only Stockholm Syndrome. It is something more complex and more human than that. It is the psychology of people who have invested everything, identity, community, memory, the meaning of their lives, in a place and a purpose that the outside world regards as a tragedy. To acknowledge the full horror of what happened in City 40 is, for many of its residents, to unmake the narrative that gave their lives meaning. And so they hold onto the version they were given, that they were the shield of the nation, that their sacrifice was noble, that the closed gates were not a prison wall but a mark of distinction. Now, let's move to a parallel story, because City 40 is not the only erased city in Russia's secret geography. Deep in Siberia, in the Krasnoyarsk Krai region, Zheleznogorsk is one of the most intriguing remnants of the Soviet Union's secret geography, a city that, for decades, didn't exist. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, the city wasn't on maps and was only known by the codename Krasnoyarsk 26. Then, in 1992, it was finally christened Zheleznogorsk. During the Soviet era, entry required special permission, even for citizens, and foreigners were completely banned. Krasnoyarsk 26. Another postal code masquerading as a city name. Another place where tens of thousands of people lived and worked and raised families in a location that could not be acknowledged. But Zheleznogorsk had a feature that made it even more extraordinary than City 40. Its primary facilities were not simply hidden behind fences and perimeter walls. They were built inside a mountain, literally carved out of granite bedrock, deep in the Siberian forest. designed to survive a nuclear strike and continue operating even as the world above burned. Its unique underground facilities allow it to manage nuclear waste and is heavily involved in Russian space technology. Think about the engineering ambition required for that. The Soviet Union did not just build a secret city, it built a secret underground nuclear complex inside a mountain within that secret city, in the middle of Siberia, and then erased the entire thing from every map and official record in existence. And it worked. For decades, the Western intelligence community had only fragmentary, unverified information about what was happening at Krasnoyarsk 26. The city was too remote, too hidden, too comprehensively concealed for normal intelligence gathering methods to penetrate effectively. And this is where the story of Russia's erased cities stops being a historical curiosity and becomes a live strategic intelligence problem. Because Zheleznogorsk is still a closed city. Right now, while life in Russia has changed hugely in the generations since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we at least know about the city, it's still not possible to visit unless you have an invitation from the Russian state. According to informed sources tracking Russian nuclear infrastructure, as of 2023, approximately 38 publicly acknowledged Zato exist, with estimates suggesting up to 15 additional undisclosed ones, housing around 5 million residents in total. These entities maintain strict entry controls, requiring special permits for Russians and prohibiting most foreigners, enforced via checkpoints and surveillance to protect sensitive facilities. 15 additional undisclosed ones. Let that register. In 2025, in an era of commercial satellite imagery and global internet access and real-time geospatial intelligence, there are estimated to be up to 15 closed cities in Russia whose existence has not been officially acknowledged. Cities with populations, cities with infrastructure, cities where people are right now living and working in conditions of enforced secrecy that the outside world has almost no visibility into. And what are those cities being used for? What requires that level of concealment in the modern era when the Cold War is officially over and the Soviet Union has been dissolved for more than 3 decades? Continued operations at sites tied to Russia's nuclear arsenal modernization under programs like the 2020 State Armament Program, with examples of enduring closures including Zheleznogorsk, focused on closed-cycle nuclear fuel reprocessing, and Severomorsk, the Northern Fleet headquarters, both retaining Zato status into the 2020s. Nuclear arsenal modernization. In 2025, with Russia engaged in its largest military operation since the Second World War, with nuclear rhetoric emanating regularly from the Kremlin, with Russia's nuclear doctrine publicly revised to lower the threshold for nuclear use, the facilities inside those closed cities are not historical relics. They are operational. They are active. They are relevant to the security calculations of every nation on Earth. And here's something that most mainstream coverage of Russia's nuclear program completely misses. The closed cities are not just production facilities. They are also the home of Russia's most advanced nuclear weapons design work. Sarov is regarded as the most significant closed city in Russia. The closed city is regarded as the birthplace of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program. Currently, it remains a central hub for Rosatom nuclear research and development. And according to open source intelligence analysis published by Frontelligence Insight, recent satellite imagery has identified facility expansions and new constructions on the grounds of Sarov, formerly known as Arzama 16, the birthplace of the Soviet nuclear project. Nestled within the Mordovsky Nature Reserve, a seemingly serene forest located 370 kilometers from Moscow harbors a complex of secret facilities. New construction. In 2025, at Russia's most significant nuclear weapons design facility, in the middle of a war, behind fences that remain as impenetrable today as they were during the height of the Cold War. This is not chaos. This is strategy. The closed city system was never simply a product of Stalinist paranoia or Cold War siege mentality. It was a deliberate architectural choice, a way of creating spaces of absolute state control within which activities could proceed that would be impossible to conduct under any kind of external oversight. And that architecture has not been dismantled. It has been modernized, updated, adapted to the requirements of the 21st century. The fences are the same. The checkpoints are the same. The culture of secrecy is the same. But the technologies being developed inside those fences are generations ahead of what Stalin's scientists were building in the late 1940s. Now consider the human dimension of all of this once more, because this story is not just about weapons and geopolitics. It is about what happens to human beings when an entire society is built around a secret. Cities like Zvezny Gorodok, the Cosmonaut Training Center, and Sarov began cooperating with international organizations on specific projects, though the war in Ukraine has halted most of these activities. For a brief period after the Cold War, there were genuine efforts at openness, international scientific exchanges, cooperative nuclear security programs, joint research initiatives. People who had spent their entire lives behind those fences got a glimpse of a different possibility, A world where the secret could finally gradually begin to be told. But that window has closed, and in its place the Russian state has reasserted a version of the closed city logic that would have been recognizable to Stalin himself. The idea that the most critical work of the state must happen in spaces of total information control, shielded from any external view. What does this mean in practice? It means that the Teka River is still contaminated. It means that the villages downstream from Mayak still have elevated cancer rates and birth defects that are officially attributed to other causes. It means that the descendants of the workers who built City 40, who chose 5 years of radioactive exposure over 25 years in Siberia, and got neither freedom nor survival, are still living in and around one of the most contaminated landscapes on Earth, with limited compensation, limited medical support, and limited official acknowledgement that anything was ever done wrong. Starting in the earliest period of Mayak Production Association activities, large amounts of liquid high-level radioactive waste from the radiochemical facility were placed into long-term controlled storage in metal tanks installed in concrete vaults. The tanks were water-cooled and equipped with temperature and liquid level measurement devices. In September 1957, as a result of a failure of the temperature control system of tank number 14, cooling water delivery became insufficient, and radioactive decay caused an increase in temperature, followed by complete evaporation of the water, and the nitrate salt deposits were heated to 330 to 350 degrees Celsius. The same logic that allowed that cooling system to remain unrepaired, the logic that said production targets matter more than maintenance protocols, that the weapon matters more than the worker, that the secret matters more than the truth, that logic has not been examined, confronted, or reformed. It has simply been carried forward, embedded in the institutional culture of a facility that is still operating, still processing nuclear materials, still the beating heart of a closed city that the Russian state still insists you cannot visit without its permission. And here's the final dimension of this story, the one that connects everything from Stalin's 1948 directive to the satellite imagery of new construction at Sarov in 2025. The closed city system is not just a historical legacy or a geopolitical curiosity. It is a model, a proof of concept, a demonstration that a modern state can, if it chooses, create zones of absolute concealment within which activities of any scale, any consequence, any danger can proceed without accountability, without oversight, and without the knowledge of the outside world. The concept of a closed city isn't exclusive to the USSR and Russia, as similar forms exist or have existed in various countries for security and restrictive reasons, but Russia has refined this concept over 75 years into something no other state has matched. The infrastructure of concealment is mature. The culture of secrecy is institutionalized. The legal framework, the Zato system, provides a bureaucratic legitimacy that allows the Russian state to maintain zones of absolute information control without even needing to deny their existence. They simply exist in a category that is defined by law as beyond public access. What most people are not seeing is that this system is becoming more relevant, not less, as the world moves deeper into an era of nuclear competition, as China accelerates its nuclear expansion, as North Korea continues to develop its weapons program, as the arms control architecture built between the United States and Russia in the 1990s collapses treaty by treaty. The closed cities of Russia are not relics. They are the infrastructure of the next phase of nuclear competition, and they are operating right now behind fences that have never come down in cities that for all the world officially knows still do not exist. Ozersk and the surrounding region is one of the most contaminated places on the planet, referred to by some as the graveyard of the earth. Yet the majority of residents do not want to leave, because for them, the closed city is not a cage. It is a community. It is an identity. It is the only world they have ever known. And the tragedy, the real human tragedy, buried beneath all the geopolitics and the weapons programs and the Cold War history, is that the choice was never really theirs to make. Their grandparents were brought there under conditions of controlled coercion. Their parents were born into a system that defined their concealment as patriotism, and they themselves grew up in cities whose entire logic told them that the invisible life was the meaningful life, that the erased city was, paradoxically, the most important city in the country. The invisible are always the most important. The secret is always the most powerful. The erased city is always somewhere deep in the logic of the closed system. The real city, the one that matters, the one that runs the machinery that the visible world depends on. And somewhere in the granite mountains of Siberia, and in the forests of the Ural region, and in the restricted zones that still do not appear on any map your phone can access, the work continues. The facilities expand, the programs advance, and the fences hold. The question that nobody in the mainstream conversation is asking is this: what is being built right now behind those fences that we will not know about for another 30 years? What decisions are being made in those windowless rooms in cities without names that will define the strategic landscape of the next generation? And when we finally find out, if we finally find out, will it already be too late to do anything about it? The town was erased from the map, but what was built inside it, the weapons, the contamination, the institutional logic of total secrecy that was never erased. It was only hidden. And the difference between erased and hidden is the most important distinction in modern geopolitics, because what is erased is gone, but what is hidden is still out there, still operational, still growing, still waiting to be revealed in a way that will change everything. The map was always a lie. The question is what truth it was hiding.